Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in today. Today I want to cover how I set up Plex on my UNRAID server, as well as just a quick overview of my hardware. If you want to learn more about running Plex on UNRAID, then you want to see the rest of this video. If you've not already done so, please don't forget to subscribe and click that notifications icon so you'll be notified of future content. Okay, before we get into Plex, I want to kind of give you a quick overview of the hardware I'm using for my UNRAID server. It's nothing really exotic or special. It's mostly parts that I had laying around, but I just go over what I'm using right now to give you a better idea. So when you see the performance, you'll kind of be able to relate to it. So I'm running a total of 7 drives. So let me click over to the main window. And as you can see, I'm running 1 parity and basically 6 data drives. I'm using 2 6TB Western Digital Reds, 1 for parity, 1 for data, and the other 5 are Western Digital Reds 4TB drives. I have all of this pumped into a HighPoint 2720 SGL RAID controller that I've had for many years. It's not using RAID, it's using legacy bypass, so I'm just running it as a SATA controller basically. For a cache drive, I'm using a QNAP QDA A2 MAR, which I did a separate video on. I'll post a link to. It's basically a 2.5-inch enclosure that allows you to mount 2 M.2 drives in it and allow you to configure them either in a RAID 0 or RAID 1. In my case, I picked a RAID 1, which makes this ideal for a cache drive because your data, when it's on the cache drive, is really not protected until it gets moved to your storage array. Using something like the QNAP makes it ideal because the cache drive itself has hardware redundancy. So you basically have 2 M.2s in the enclosure acting as redundancy. Now, data doesn't stay on the cache that long, but it's just an extra step. And since I had the hardware, I went ahead and I thought it was an ideal use for it. Now, there are other ways to do it. This just happens to be the way I did it because partially because I had the hardware. For a CPU, I'm using a relatively low-end i3-8100. It's a quad core, and it does support quick sync, and that's really the critical thing that I wanted to make sure that my UNRAID server had quick sync support because we want to be able to set up hardware transcoding in Plex. And then I have that pumped into a ASUS Maximum Hero motherboard that I had for quite some time. For network cards, I could certainly use the built-in card, but I'm using the Sonic card, 10 gigabit card that I did a review on recently. I'll post a link to that review, and that does an excellent job getting data into the server. I'll give you a quick shot of performance here so you can kind of get a baseline for it. And obviously this isn't necessary. You can use a standard 1 gigabit card. It's fine for 99.9% of the time. I just happen to have this card, so I wanted to put it to good use. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and run the benchmark. To give you an idea how this performs, I'm going to take a 23 gig test file, and I'm going to move it to my UNRAID server, and you can see it's clipping along. Now once the initial memory fills up, it will start to drop a bit. So you'll see it drop and hover right around 450, 500, and it's going to stay that way through the rest of the duration. So you can kind of get an idea of how this thing performs. It'll finish out in no time. So moving, large files is kind of a breeze. Now just bear in mind this is moving to a cache drive, and it's obviously running over 10 gigabit connection. So your mileage may vary, but depending on the type of cache drive you have in your networking and so on. But you can see what it's capable of, and it does a really good job. Okay, so that gave you a better idea of how it performs. Now let's get into the actual Plex configuration, because this is really a multi-step process. Probably not quite as easy as I would like it to be, but it's once you understand it, it does work really well, and it does get you where you want to go. The very first thing we're going to want to do is to download the Plex application into UNRAID. Now there's a bunch of different ways to do that. The way that I chose to, which is more of probably a default way of doing it, is to first download and install a plugin called the Community Applications. And if you search for it, you'll be able to find it. I'll put a link in the notes for it. But basically, once you download that application, you can then go over to apps. You'll see a bunch of stuff listed. They've got quite a repository of applications. And if we just do a quick search for Plex, we'll find the Plex server right at the top here, which we're going to go ahead and install. You click on it, it'll give you the install option. Obviously mine's already installed, so it's not going to show install again. But go ahead and click install and it'll pop it in. And then the first thing we need to do after that, once it's installed, is we'll want to next create a movie share or a content share so that we can get that established and put that into the Plex configuration. So I'm going to suggest you do that. So what I did is I went ahead and I created a share called movies. So by clicking on shares, you can click on add share, and the process is relatively simple. Name, the only other thing you really have to give it or change is whether or not you want to use the cache. So my suggestion is, for your initial copy of, if you're going to copy large amounts of media, 3, 4, 5 terabytes, in my case 9 terabytes, if you're going to initially copy that, then what I would do is leave it off for now so you're not hammering your cache drive. You can always re-enable it later. But if you're moving just 10 or 20 or 30 gigs or whatever you have, then go ahead and enable it now, because it's not going to make that much difference. So once you let me just go ahead and create one. I'm going to create a share. I'm going to say, I'm going to leave all this alone. I'm going to enable the cache, and I'm going to hit add share. And then it pops up with another section where we establish security. So I'm going to walk you through the entire thing. So in this case, I'm going to leave everything the same, except I'm going to make it private. And I'm just going to flip over to show you the one that I already created, and that's this one here. So if I look at that, you can see how the basic configuration is. I've set it to private, and I've given read and write access to, and read-only access to another user. So once you're all done with that, your movie is kind of set up and ready to go. And take note of this movie's name, because I'm going to show you where that actually goes in later on. Okay, once you've created the share, it's now time to configure the actual configuration of the Plex application. So there's a couple things that we need to do. So let's go ahead and click on edit. Now yours will, so once we select edit, we're now going to need to make some configurations changes to this particular section. Of course, there's the name, which you can change optionally. I've left the first 3 by itself as default. I haven't touched them. I left them alone. The 2 that we're going to really change here is path 2 and path 3. So path 2 is actually where your transcoding takes place, and you can create a share in your cache drive to allow you to transcode to that particular drive, and that works perfectly well. The other alternative is to use what I've done, which is a /TMP, which basically transcodes into RAM, which I think is much better, much more efficient. So this is what I've chosen to do. You don't require any further configuration. Put the /TMP in there and you're done. It'll transcode to RAM. Under path 3 is where that one share that we created for the top level media, that's where this is going. So by clicking on this, you can drill through and see your different shares, find your shares under the MMT user that you created, the one in my case called movies, and that's going to point the system to share that you're storing your media in. The third thing you have to do here is to copy that link that's listed probably on yours and go ahead and get a claim from Plex, because you'll need to associate that server. So go ahead and get the claim, paste that in, and for now that's all we're going to do. The rest are going to stay at default. This last entry with the dev/dri on there. You won't have yet. I'm going to show you how to add that later and what it's going to do. And this is where we're going to enable hardware decoding. So we're going to come back to that. So for now, this is all you're going to need to do. So the next thing we want to do is actually we want to configure the Plex server itself. We need to do a few things on the Plex server app itself, not the UNRAID configuration, but the actual application. So we're going to go over here to under the dashboard or under Docker. You can get it either way. I'm going to use the dashboard. And click on that and go ahead and type and click on Web UI. This will take you into your Plex configuration. You may land on a different page here, but that's okay. But ultimately you're going to want to go into settings and you're going to want to change a few things in Plex. So I'm going to show you what you need to change, and at least for starters, you can always go back in and do refined configurations. But the very first thing you're going to want to go to is remote access. Now, remote access is the one that actually allows you to access Plex from the outside. And this one is a two-part configuration. One is to enable it and set a few other things, but the other is you're going to have to create a port forward rule in your router, and I can't help you with that because there's too many routers, too many different ways to do it. So you'll have to figure out how to do a port forward, and you're going to do a port forward to port 32400. Now, you can also assign a custom port, and you might want to do this for basically one reason, and that's if you have multiple servers. In my case, I have 2 Plex servers, so I've assigned unique port numbers to each one, and of course a unique IP. That way, when they show up in the web UI, there are 2, they don't get confused, and when I do a port forward, it doesn't get confused. But if you're just running a single Plex server, you can just leave this as default. You don't need to do much with it. I would suggest at this point you change these 2 settings, which is the internet upload speed, and also to limit the bit stream. Now, you can do whatever you want with this. It just depends on your bandwidth. I've picked a comfortable 4 megabit 720 stream coming out, just so in the event that there's 2 or 3 users, it's not going to bog down my internet connection. So I've limited it to 5. When you're done with that, go ahead and hit Save Changes. The next one you want to go to is the network folders. Force a secure connection. You don't want to be transmitting or communicating without a secure connection. Okay, the next tab you want to go to is the transcoder. So when you click on transcoder, the only thing you're going to want to check, if it's available to you, is to use hardware acceleration when available and hardware accelerated video encoding where available. If these two items are not there, make sure you've got the show advanced option on, and if they're still not there, we'll have to come back to it after we enable the hardware acceleration. If you have them there now, go ahead and click them on, save your changes. That's pretty much all we need to do on this particular page. Now, what I would do at this point is go ahead and copy a couple of movie files in so you can kind of test it out. The other thing you're going to want to do is actually create libraries. So when you go to libraries here, you're going to want to go ahead and add that library that you created. So if I go ahead and click on Add Library, I'm now able to go ahead and add folders. And you can see here my data folder, which is the one that we configured in the earlier screen where we actually pointed to a share. That's where under data, that's correlating to this data folder. So when I click on data, I see a couple of subfolders that I created, and I can point to any one of these. So what I'm going to suggest is your main share is your hierarchy, and then you can create subfolders for your media underneath it. And then you can point to these as individual libraries. You can grab the whole thing if they're all the same thing. But in my case, I have 2 different kind of files for 2 different purposes. So I separated them. So I'm going to cancel this because I already have it set up. And you can see my two folders. So I have an MKV folder and an MP4 folder. The reason I separate them is my MKVs are uncompressed, full Blu-ray quality, and my MP4s have been basically transcoded down to a much lower resolution. It's not necessary to do that anymore. That's just what I had from a previous setup. If you've got the right configuration and after we enable the hardware, you can just use one type of file and you're good to go. Because even a small CPU like this one will transcode a full Blu-ray down to a 720p without breaking a sweat. I'm going to show you that in a little bit. Okay, now that I've set up my libraries, now we need to do a few more things to make sure that the hardware is enabled. So we're going to go ahead and close this. But in order for us to be able to enable hardware decoding, we've got to make a few tweaks to UNRAID. So let's get into that here real quick. So the first thing you're going to want to know is whether or not it's already enabled. Mostly it's not, but if just in case, you need to check it. So we're going to pull up the terminal window, which you can get up into this section in here. And what we're going to want to do is type in some commands to see if we get a response. So I'm going to do a cd space /dev/dri. And I'm going to go to ls. Now, in all probability, when you do this, you won't get anything. You'll get blanks or an error message of some type. So don't panic. Mine's already been set up, so you're going to see this is what you're going to want to see at the end, not necessarily what you initially see. So to fix that, what we're going to do is actually activate the hardware decoding. So we're going to say mod probei 915 and hit enter. Now what that should do is should prompt you with the same directory that I have right now. Of course mine's already done, but it's just doing it again. And now when you do that we did on the previous screen, you'll get a different prompt. So now you'll be able to see when you get the card 0 render D128, you now know that your hardware decoding is active. So again, just to clarify that, you're going to type from the terminal window, you're going to type the cd space /dev/dri, hit enter, type ls, hit enter, and you're most likely going to get blank. And if you, assuming that you do, you're going to then go back in and type mode probe, MOD PROBE I915, hit enter, and then retype the same two commands that you did on the top, the cd space /dev/dri, enter, ls, enter, until you see card 0 render D128. Once you have that, you now have hardware enabled temporarily. We'll get into that here in just a minute. So the next thing, once we get this, is we need to give ourselves permission. We're going to go ahead and type from the same command window, we're going to type chmod space -R space 777 space /dev. Okay, now what that did is give us permissions. It gave the device driver permissions from the system. So basically the Docker container can now access the hardware decoding driver. So now that we have permissions to use the device, we can now go back in, do one last change to the Plex configuration, and then we can test it. So let's go back in and click on our Plex server, click on edit, and from here what we're going to do is we're going to click on add path, port, variable, or device. And I've already done it here, but I'm going to walk you through how it's done. And you're basically going to pick device, and for the value and name you're going to pick, it's going to be /dev/dri, and the same thing /dev/dri. Same thing for the value. So the name and value are exactly the same. I'm going to cancel this because I've already done it, and I'm going to show you what it looks like here. So let's edit. You'll see it's exactly the same, and it now appears with a device called /dev/dri. So what that does is it connects Plex to the hardware device. So once we're done with that, go ahead and hit apply. And once you've applied your settings, now if you weren't able to activate the hardware decoding before in Plex, you should now be able to do that. So if you click on Plex and go to the web UI, you should now be able to go to transcoder and be able to select the hardware acceleration if you weren't already able to do it before. So you need to make sure that gets closed. So now what we want to do is to test this, make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do. And if it is, we'll need to do one last thing, because the settings that we just made and the commands that we just typed, they'll disappear if we reboot our server. They're temporary right now. They're just typed into RAM. We don't want that to take place. You want to have those settings available to you every time you reboot. So let's test this out and then we'll go from there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my dashboard, and right now there's nothing playing. So what I'm going to do is go to another system here. So what I'm doing right now is playing a movie that's actually a native Blu-ray file, and it's transcoding it down to a 720p. Now what you can see here, and the important part here, is that you see this H, is that next to here you see where the transcoding is taking place, is that you see that it says it's transcoding it down to a 720p and it's using hardware. And that's what you want to see. If you're not seeing that, then you're not actually transcoding using hardware. If it just says transcode without the HW, then something's not quite right. We need to start over from the beginning. So if we take a look while we're transcoding here, I want to show you basically what the impact is to the CPU. So I'm going to flip over to dashboard, and you can see here that I'm using about 22, 25 at the worst case, and this will lower as the movie starts to play and queue up a little bit. But you can see it's ranging anywhere from all the way down to 1 up to about low 20s in terms of processor resources. Now, that is actually pretty good given that this is a Core i3. The hardware decoding makes a tremendous difference in terms of performance. Having the ability to transcode that down on the fly without having to do any pre-conversion to your movies or anything, and taking a native Blu-ray and basically being able to transcode it down is a huge benefit. So it's definitely worth having a CPU that will support it. Now you can use a GPU for the process. And that's not going to be covered in this video, but obviously from a power efficiency point of view, having an Intel CPU that's QuickSync compatible is much more beneficial. So now that we've verified that it's working, we've tested it, everything's good to go. Now we got to save these settings. We got to make sure that these settings don't get changed. We're going to do that by going back to the terminal window. And what we're going to want to do is create or modify a file called the Go file. And what we're going to type first is we're going to type nano/boot/config/go, and it'll pull open a file, your Go file. Now, as you can see, I've already modified mine. Yours will be blank. And you'll scroll down to the bottom of the file, and you're going to type the following commands. Mode probe, which is the same thing we typed before. It's modprob space I19 or 915. I'm sorry. Hit enter, and then you're going to do a chmod -R space 777 space /dev/dri. And once you do that, you're going to hit Control X, and there's nothing to save in my case, but you're going to hit Control S. It's going to prompt you to save. You're going to hit yes for Y, or Y for yes, I mean. And make sure you hit enter at this point. If you just hit yes and you don't hit enter, it's not going to save. And I've made that mistake a couple of times. So make sure that after you hit save yes, that you hit enter, and that Go file will be saved, and your system will now, whenever you reboot, will activate the hardware decoding, so you shouldn't have any problems going forward. At this point, you're kind of done. At this point, you're in a position where you can start adding media go ahead and start to learn more about how Plex is configured. I'd suggest you do some research on file naming for Plex and anything else you might want to know that's outside the scope of this video. And of course, if there are specific suggestions that you'd like to see, if I get enough of them, I'll be glad to do a video on them. Post your comments and questions and let me know what you think. So I hope that was helpful. I know there's a lot of steps involved in doing this. But at the end of the day, when it's all done, you're going to really enjoy it. It works really well. The one advantage of having this on UNRAID, besides it being contained in one box, is that UNRAID allows you to scale your drives. One of the things that have always been a limiter for me, and I have roughly 4 NAS units, and I have a Windows 2019 server, and I've had other storage devices in the past, that most of them I've used a RAID 5 or RAID 6 configuration, and which works out really, really well, and you can continue to expand that storage as long as you put identical drives in. With UNRAID, you obviously have the ability to increase your storage in increments of whatever you want. So whatever drives you happen to have, you can put them in, since it's an aggregator more than anything else. As you can see, I've got a variety of drives here, and I would now have a total of 26 terabytes, just basically recycling drives. So it's a great way to go, and with Plex on board, it makes a great single-purpose device. And of course, you can expand it. You can add VMs, more applications, more Dockers, more whatever you want. You can do all those things you want, but at least from a baseline and from a perspective of your media source, this is a great way to go. And since you can do it with repurposed hardware, you don't have to spend thousands of dollars to get this configured. You can kind of build it and add to it as you go along. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, throw a like on there. And as always, if you haven't subscribed, please do so, and click that notifications icon so you'll be notified of future content. We'll see you on the next video.